This hour, I'll talk about the U.S. strike in Syria with Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who recently met with Bashar al-Assad. And our correspondents, analysts, and other guests, they are all standing by. First, let's go to our Chief National Security Correspondent, Jim Sciutto, with more on the strikes and the U.S.-Syria strategy. Jim?
Wolf, today the Pentagon doing its first bomb damage assessments to look at the effects of this strike. This is the al-Assad base here in central Syria. This is a look at that base before the strikes there, and this is a look after. The number of targets hit. The Pentagon says 59 cruise missiles striking 59 targets on base. There was a 60th missile that went down in the Mediterranean. They launched another to replace that, destroying, they estimate, 20 Syrian aircraft, a number of hardened aircraft shelters, as well as weapons depots, ammo depots, fuel depots, and radar installations here. I should note what they did not strike are the runways here, those still operational, still usable. The focus was Syrian forces, although this is a base that has also been used by the Russians. Of course, it's the Syrians that the U.S. blamed for this attack, but now we know the Pentagon is investigating whether Russia was complicit in the chemical weapons attack as well. Tonight, the U.S. military is investigating whether Russia was complicit in the Syrian regime's gruesome chemical weapons attack on civilians earlier this week. Specifically, whether a Russian warplane dropped a bomb on a hospital treating victims of the attack 5 hours later, perhaps to destroy evidence. The probe comes after President Trump ordered a barrage of missiles on a Syrian airbase in retaliation for the deadly attack. The first U.S. military strike against the Assad regime in the country's bloody 6-year civil war. Today, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley warned of possible further U.S. military action.
The United States took a very measured step last night. We are prepared to do more, but we hope that will not be necessary.
The target of the strikes was Syria's Shayrat air base, launch point for the Syrian warplanes that carried out the chemical attack. The Pentagon says 59 of 60 Tomahawk cruise missiles severely degraded or destroyed their targets, including aircraft, hardened aircraft shelters, fuel and ammunition dumps, and air defense systems. The Pentagon estimates some 20 aircraft were destroyed, though video of the aftermath shows several shelters still standing and military aircraft undamaged. U.S. missiles left the runway intact and avoided chemical weapons storage to prevent civilian casualties. And U.S. commanders warned the Russian military 1 hour in advance to avoid accidentally striking Russian military personnel or assets. Still, Russian President Vladimir Putin, Assad's primary backer diplomatically and militarily, immediately declared the U.S. airstrikes, quote, an act of aggression that, quote, dealt a serious blow to Russia-U.S. relations. Syria, which says 9 people were killed in the strikes, claimed the U.S. has undermined the fight against terrorism.
This condemnable U.S. aggression confirms the continuation of the flawed U.S. strategy, and it undermines the process of combating terrorism. It makes the U.S. a partner of the Islamic State and al-Nusra and other terrorist organizations.
The march to military action took little more than 48 hours. The planning began Tuesday, the day the world saw the first images of victims, many of them children, of the chemical weapons attack. On Thursday, before President Trump sat down to dinner with the Chinese president, he met with his national security team to discuss military options, deciding then to order the strike that night. At 8:40 p.m. Eastern Time, the middle of the night in Syria, the attack began. 2 U.S. warships in the eastern Mediterranean, the USS Porter and the USS Ross, launched the 60 Tomahawk missiles towards the Syrian airbase. Trump sat through dinner alongside the Chinese president as the attack was underway. Then, just 35 minutes later, at approximately 9:15 p.m. Eastern Time, the president's national security team briefed him on the mission's results. This was, we should emphasize, Wolf, a very narrowly targeted attack. One air base here to send a message, in effect, about the use, in particular, of chemical weapons. It did not affect, really, or significantly impact the Syrian military's capability to carry out war against its own people, keep in mind, by conventional means. And let's remember, that's the primary means they've been using, particularly with civilian casualties, including barrel bombs dropped from helicopters, etc. That the Syrian military maintains. Wolf.
Jim Sciutto reporting for us. Thanks for that report. Also tonight, the Trump administration says it's preparing to announce new sanctions against Syria in addition to the military strike. The White House calling the action ordered by the president decisive, justified, and proportional. Let's go to our senior White House correspondent, Jim Acosta. He's with the president down in Palm Beach, Florida. Jim, has the president given any indication of what his next move or moves might be, or is his overall stance toward Bashar al-Assad?
They're not telegraphing their next steps, Wolf, and White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer says that's by design. The president is expected to remain here all weekend here in Florida, Wolf, and he'll continue to receive updates on the situation in Syria after last night's missile strikes. I did talk to a senior administration official earlier today who said these missile strikes in Syria should not be interpreted as the beginning of a wider campaign to take out Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad. I think that's why you've been hearing all day long administration officials using words like proportional and measured in talking about last night's strikes. We did hear from some of the president's cabinet members late today. As you said, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin told reporters that the administration will be seeking new economic sanctions against Syria in the days ahead. And Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said they will be studying the Syrian regime's response to what happened last night to determine exactly what the administration should do next, Wolf.
All of this is happening, Jim, as there's now some serious talk of a possible staff shakeup at the highest levels of the Trump inner circle. What are you finding out?
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable considering what's happening this week, Wolf. But publicly, the White House is adamant no major shakeup is coming soon. But we have talked to multiple sources who tell us that much of the talk about a shakeup is centering on Chief of Staff Reince Priebus and Chief Strategist Steve Bannon, two of the original members of this administration, first named by President Trump. Now, we should point out that both Priebus and Bannon, and let's put this up on screen, they both appear in that photograph taken in the secured room where the president was keeping tabs on the military operation in Syria, also sitting down at the dinner table with the Chinese president last night. So this would be an odd time for the president to force them out. But I'm told that talk of a shakeup inside the West Wing is reaching, quote, critical mass. Our sources are even naming some potential replacements for Priebus as chief of staff. But Wolf, a senior White House official who I was talking to on the phone earlier today, was adamant, saying all of this talk is wrong, calling it palace intrigue. But it's clear, Wolf, the president's team is not all on the same page all week long. We've heard about sparring between staffers loyal to Stephen Bannon and those loyal to the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And one sign of that friction, Wolf, that I think is very important, Steve Bannon, we're told, was not in favor of these strikes in Syria. So clearly, the president's team not on the same page. A lot of infighting, it sounds, and it's unclear how the president will sort it all out by the end of this weekend, Wolf.
All right, Jim, thanks very much. Jim Acosta down in Palm Beach, Florida for us. Let's get some more on all of this. Joining us, a Democratic Congresswoman, Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii. She's a member of the Armed Services and Foreign Affairs Committee, served in the U.S. Army in Iraq. She also met back in January in Damascus with President Bashar al-Assad. Congresswoman, thanks very much for joining us.
Aloha, Wolf. Good to talk to you.
All right, let's talk about this chemical attack. You tweeted about the attack, and I'll put it up on the screen. You tweeted this: whoever is found responsible, be it the Syrian government, al-Qaeda, or ISIS, all have access to chemical weapons, must be held accountable. Who do you believe is responsible for that chemical attack that killed so many civilians, including so many children?
Here's the issue, Wolf, is what I believe, what you believe, or others believe is irrelevant. What matters here is the evidence and the facts. If President Assad is found to be responsible after an independent investigation for these horrific chemical weapons attacks, I'll be the first one to denounce him, to call him a war criminal, and to call for his prosecution, the International Criminal Court. Make sure that those consequences are there. But the key is now, with President Trump's reckless military strikes last night, it flew directly in the face of the action that the UN was working on at that time to launch an independent investigation, to find out exactly what the facts are, who was involved and who was responsible, so that the appropriate consequences could be levied.
So, Congresswoman, when the Pentagon says it was the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad who was responsible, when the Secretary of State says that, the President says that, they all conclude that they have the evidence to back it up. They say Assad did it, his military did it. You don't believe them necessarily.
Well, last time I checked, Wolf, Congress had the authority and the responsibility for declaring war, for authorizing the use of military force. So whether the president or the Pentagon or the Secretary of State says that they have the evidence, the fact remains that they have not brought that evidence before Congress. They have not brought that evidence before the American people, and they have not sought authorization from Congress to launch this military attack on another country. The fact is that the United States has been waging this war, this regime change war now for years, covertly through the CIA to overthrow the Syrian government. The result of this has been the suffering of the Syrian people, hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions of refugees, and the strengthening of terrorist groups in Syria, like al-Qaeda and ISIS, whose goal is to overthrow the Syrian government. So this escalation that President Trump took yesterday in launching this military attack continues this illegal, unconstitutional war.
So, Congresswoman, are you saying when General Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, or General McMaster, the President's National Security Advisor, come to the President and they say, here's the evidence, we now know for sure that the Syrian regime did this, here are the various military options to respond, and he gives the okay, you say you have doubts about these generals providing that kind of proof to the president?
Well, Wolf, I remind you about what happened before we launched an invasion and occupation of Iraq. Then Colin Powell and many others within the administration came to Congress and came to the UN claiming they had the evidence proving that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. We launched a completely destructive, counterproductive war based on that intelligence, which has now, years later, proven to be wrong. We had leaders in Congress then who questioned that evidence that was presented and voted against that war because they were not convinced by the administration then, saying that they had the proof necessary to launch this war. So yes, I'm skeptical because we have to take at a premium the cost of these wars, not only on the Syrian people and the people in the Middle East, but the cost of these wars here in the United States at a time where, we don't have money to build the roads that we need here in Hawaii or in other parts of the country. Why should we just blindly follow this escalation of a counterproductive regime change war, sending American taxpayer dollars on these failed regime change wars that we've seen too often in Iraq, in Libya, and now continuing in Syria?
Because the Pentagon says they have radar tracking that shows that Syrian regime planes were in the air at the time of this attack. They also say they have heat signatures showing that those planes dropped those chemical bombs in those areas where the civilians were exposed to that kind of nerve agent. But what I hear you saying is you don't necessarily buy that.
Well, once again, Wolf, all I'm saying is that we have an executive branch of government and a legislative branch of government. And we need to see the evidence. Congress and the American people need to see and analyze this evidence and then make a decision based on that whether or not an authorization of U.S. military force is necessary. And what I'm telling you is that that hasn't happened. I have not seen that independent investigation occur and that proof presented showing exactly what happened. And there are a number of theories that are out there on exactly what occurred that day.
You met with President Bashar al-Assad in Damascus this past January, just a little while ago. Do you doubt, Congresswoman, that he's capable of launching a chemical attack on his own citizens? Because the Obama administration said he did it back several times in 2013 until the Russians came in and said they would try to destroy all of his chemical weapons stockpiles.
Again, this isn't about what I believe or what I doubt. What matters the most here are the facts. The American people deserve to see and know of the evidence and the facts before authorizing the continuation of this destructive, counterproductive, illegal regime change war. Our interest, Wolf, must be on bringing about peace. That if we truly care and are compassionate for the Syrian people, these children and women and innocent people who are being most impacted by this war, we need to end this destructive regime change war, not escalate it as the president has just done through his illegal military strike launched last night.
Why did you meet, Congresswoman, with President Bashar al-Assad? You know, you got a lot of criticism for going to Damascus and meeting with him. Why did you decide to meet with him?
You know, I went to Syria in the interest of furthering the cause of peace, to see and hear firsthand from the Syrian people how we can bring about an end to this counterproductive regime change war, something that I have been fighting for now as a member of Congress for years. Whether we like it or not, President Assad remains the president of Syria. And in order to determine a negotiated outcome to end this regime change war that, again, has cost hundreds of thousands of lives and millions of refugees, he has a part to play in bringing about that negotiated outcome. We should not continue this counterproductive regime change war, to overthrow the Syrian government, first and foremost because it will be destructive to the Syrian people, just like we saw our wars in Iraq and Libya turned out to be worse off for the people of those countries. And just like in those two countries, we're already seeing this war we've been waging for years has only proven to strengthen these terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and like ISIS, who are trying to overthrow the government so that they can walk in and fill that vacuum and take over all of Syria for their own nefarious means.
Who is responsible, Congresswoman, for the deaths of more than 400,000 Syrians, mostly civilians and a lot of children, elderly? Who do you blame for those deaths over the past 6 years?
There are a number of ways that you can point the finger, Wolf. I'm interested in finding the solution, and the solution is to end this counterproductive regime change war. The United States has been waging, along with allies, so-called allies like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, all seeking to overthrow the Syrian government. We have been providing arms, funding, salary, support, intelligence, and other types of both direct and indirect support to armed militants within Syria who are working directly with al-Qaeda, who are allied with terrorist groups like al-Qaeda towards this end of overthrowing the Syrian government. All an action which has resulted in more chaos and suffering for the Syrian people, as well as counterproductive to our American national security interests by strengthening the very enemy that attacked us on 9/11. It makes no sense, and I've spoken to you before about my bill, the Stop Arming Terrorists bill, that would put an end to this madness by prohibiting American taxpayer dollars from paying for this support, for paying for this counterproductive regime change war.
But don't you believe that Bashar al-Assad bears a lot of the responsibility for the horrific deaths that have occurred in his own country, his regime, his military going out there and killing all these people? Don't you think, Congresswoman, he bears a lot of that responsibility?
There is responsibility that goes around, Wolf. Again, my interest is in bringing about peace. Standing here and pointing fingers does not accomplish peace for the Syrian people. It will not bring about an end to this war. That is my sole focus and my interest, both for the United States and for the Syrian people. And that's why it's so important, A, that we end this destructive, counterproductive regime change war, and that we work towards bringing about a peaceful negotiation where the Syrian people can determine their own future for themselves.
You met with the president. He was then the president-elect during the transition in New York, and then you went in January to meet with President Bashar al-Assad. Did you convey any message to Bashar al-Assad from President Trump during your meeting in Damascus?
No, and any reports suggesting otherwise are complete bogus and fake news.
What was Bashar al-Assad's message to you, Congresswoman?
He talked about what was happening in his country, his interest in defeating ISIS, and talked about how to bring about an end to this war.
Do you have any regrets about going? Because you faced a lot of criticism, as I pointed out, since then.
You know, Wolf, I've never made decisions based on fear of what might people think or what might be politically advantageous for me. As a veteran, I have seen the cost of these wars, experienced them firsthand, seen the human cost in friends of mine who did not come home from the war in Iraq. I went to Congress promising my constituents, my fellow veterans and brothers and sisters in uniform that I would do all I could to prevent our country from making these kinds of disastrous and destructive mistakes again in the future. I went to Syria with the focus and mission on peace, how we can bring about an end to this destructive regime change war, and I'm continuing that fight today.
All right, Congresswoman, we got to take a quick break, but I want to continue our conversation. Let's take the break. We'll resume the discussion right after this. We're told tonight that the Pentagon is adjusting its military operations in Syria to protect American forces on the ground. This in the aftermath of the U.S. strike designed to punish the Bashar al-Assad regime for a deadly chemical attack. We're back with Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who met with Bashar al-Assad in Syria back in January. So let me just button this up, Congresswoman. I take it you were deeply disappointed by the president's decision last night. Is that right?
It made me sad and it made me angry to see that President Trump took this reckless action without really considering, frankly, the dire consequences. You've talked about in your report Russia's presence in Syria. There is no question that by launching a military attack, which is illegal and unconstitutional, against Russia, against Syria for that matter. Syria is very closely allied with Russia. Russia has their military on the ground there. So what we're talking about here really is the very high potential for a direct military conflict between the United States and Russia, the two world's nuclear powers, risking, therefore, whether intentional or unintentional, nuclear consequences.
If the Pentagon were to show you, Congresswoman, hard evidence convincing you that Bashar al-Assad's regime launched these chemical attacks against these civilians and these kids, would you change your mind and say, yes, what the U.S. did with these Tomahawk cruise missiles was justified?
No, Wolf, because escalating a counterproductive, destructive regime change war is harmful for the Syrian people and is harmful for the United States and our national security interests. We need to learn our lessons from the past. In Iraq and in Libya both, these arguments are made for humanitarian reasons to go in and overthrow these dictators, to go in and launch these wars. We've seen in both of those examples how the Iraqi people and the Libyan people have suffered far more as a result of our wars. More people have died. The countries have been destroyed, become failed nations, and counterproductive to our interests directly, terrorist groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda have only grown stronger and stronger, gaining footholds in these countries that they didn't have before. So for whether it's Senator John McCain or President Trump or any of these other people who are advocating for an escalation of this counterproductive regime change war, they're not recognizing the obvious truth, which is that it will result in a worse off situation for the Syrian people, more death, more destruction, more refugees, and it will result in our enemy, terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS, growing stronger.
If President Trump didn't act and more chemical weapons strikes were launched against Syrian civilians from that same air base, how would you feel?
Look, we've got to look at the facts and understand exactly what happened. You can talk about a number of hypothetical situations. The United Nations yesterday was debating and drafting and going through different amendments, a resolution that would have immediately launched an independent investigative team into Syria to determine exactly what happened in that attack, and then to have the evidence necessary to take something to the International Criminal Court, to actually prosecute President Assad if he was found responsible. We've got to be deliberative and recognize the facts on the ground before determining what potential courses of action are available to us.
Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Wolf.
Just ahead, we'll get more reaction to the strike in Syria from a former national security advisor to President Obama. Retired General Jim Jones is standing by live. And more on the possibility of a major shakeup of the White House senior staff. Who might be affected? Our correspondents and analysts are digging for new information right now.